thought I would start by taking a few minutes to share a story I heard earlier this week in a podcast interview with a talented young Vietnamese American poet and novelist. His name is Ocean Vuong, and he's in his 30s. He's a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient whose family fled Vietnam for the Philippines, and they eventually resettled in the US as refugees when he was 2 years old. And in the interview, Ocean is asked about the cover of his first book, which is a collection of poems, and some of them are based on the Vietnam War. And on the cover, there's like a happy picture of a little boy, and he's seated on a wooden bench between two women. And he explains that the photo is of him, his mom, and an aunt. And they're all in the refugee camp in the Philippines. And in the camp, each day, the family received rice as rations. And there was a photographer who went around making a business of taking photos. So suffice it to say that that photo cost Ocean's family 3 cups of rice. And he ended up choosing that specific photo from the camp as the cover of his first book, instead of the more typical photojournalistic image that we might see of like a sad child covered in dust walking alone, or the young Vietnamese child who's crying and running away from a chemical attack. These are sad and important photos, but he wanted instead to use an image that reflected a joyful moment with his mom, despite all the challenges and the heartache of that time. And I think the fact that he chose that picture really resonated with me while I was listening to this podcast. He had seen many photos from the Vietnam War of people who looked like him, who had been really wounded, basically. And I asked myself, could it be that representing and sharing his narrative in this way was healing for Ocean, rather than him putting an image of a moment of that's more like a violence inflicted on the body of another Vietnamese person? He chose to elevate a joyful moment, and I think in so doing, he took control of his story. And I think maybe the fringe benefit of this is that he offered up a new media representation of people who look like him or people who shared his story, that isn't based on their vulnerability or having violence perpetrated against them. And as the other panelists have mentioned, we need those kinds of alternative media representations of refugees. And so this brings me to my point that while our intentions may be good, when we're telling the story of another person or another community, it's quite challenging, isn't it, to really know the variety of experiences and emotions a person has had on their migration journey, and whether they entirely view or want to remember their journey as a painful one, or one that's a combination of pain and hope and moments of courage and lightness. I think it becomes really easy as a non-first person, the person who didn't experience the experience, to accidentally or unintentionally fall back on stereotypes about a community. And I think people deserve to have their stories told in greater nuance. So I think as organizations working on refugee matters, in order to get sort of fuller, deeper access to the journeys that displaced people have experienced, I think we can all include more refugee-led stories in our programming, definitely first and foremost. And second to that, if refugees aren't telling their own stories and we are non-members of the community, to just make sure to take those steps to research and provide a nuanced story. With that, as someone who has been working on refugee-related matters through legal policy and a film lens for the past 20 years, I wanted to, almost 20 years, I wanted to talk about the kinds of questions I sometimes receive when it comes to storytelling for refugee advocacy. And the first question I get often is, how can storytelling be useful in the refugee advocacy context? And we heard a lot of excellent points from the other panelists. And what I will say will probably reinforce and reiterate some of their points, but some of them might be different based on personal experience. I think the most obvious way that storytelling can be useful for advocacy is definitely to humanize the people whose rights and well-being is our focus. On one hand, refugees and asylum and migration issues, they're shaping policy and public discussion all around the world. And we want to play a part in raising awareness and advocating about the issues that matter to our organization and to the communities we support. On the other hand, it's almost cliche to say that we're constantly inundated with news and 24-hour news cycles and social media feeds with so much information. And when we add to that language that's distant or maybe so focused on numbers or statistics when we're talking about refugees or asylum seekers, I think it becomes difficult to capture and keep people's attentions on the issues. So if I say, for example, there are 80 million people currently displaced globally, and 26.3 million are refugees, 4.2 million are asylum seekers. These are important numbers. But 5 minutes from now, if I ask you to give me those numbers, will you remember them? And what if instead I tell you that I encountered an 18-year-old woman living near the Syria-Turkey border who told me this story about her Converse shoes that she was wearing when we met. And they were just about the only possession she brought with her when she was crossing into Turkey without her family, and she brought them because her sister had gifted them to her. Between these two, which one are you more likely to remember, the numbers or the story? For me, I know I tend to remember something that I can visualize or something I feel an emotion about. And that tends to be a single individual story. And you might be a numbers person and you might disagree with me. And I understand that numbers can be helpful, absolutely, to quantify populations and to show the scale or the gravity of displacement. But I think that statistics and numbers are more effective when used, carefully, or not as often, and in combination with individual stories to make the strongest impact. One person who makes an effort to keep the focus really on storytelling in the refugee context is the UNHCR photographer, Brian Sokol. He has a talk about a photo series he did where he asks refugees what the single most important object was that they brought with them when they fled their home country. And I think it's really interesting to have a listen to. So we won't watch it now, but I think we can drop the link. And I think Bahar just did that. Thank you. So I think it's in our interest to keep people caring about the communities we work with. And to that end, one of the easiest, I think, simplest shifts we can make is to focus a little more on stories rather than numbers. Another aspect of storytelling for advocacy that's worth mentioning, I think, is the need for more nuanced stories focused on the multiple aspects of a displaced person's identity, rather than just focusing on their problems while overlooking their strength or their resilience. Refugees are not a monolithic group, as we all know. They're just grouped together because of one aspect of their life experience, which is that they've been displaced. They have multiple experiences. Their identities can be diverse and fluid, and they had lives before the events that led them to flee. So again, displacement is only one aspect of their life. They also have desires, hopes, interests, hobbies, and struggles, as we all do. I think choosing to highlight one of these other aspects of their life, even if your ultimate goal is to tell a story about displacement, can be a different and interesting approach to take. And as the photographer Brian Sokol mentioned, the dominant Western narrative has a tendency to reduce refugees to victims and reduce their stories to tales of one-dimensional pity and sorrow, is the words that he used. And we get a lot of the repetitious images that match some of those stereotypes. So I think whether we're working at an international organization or a resettlement group or a legal organization, or we're filmmakers, photographers, journalists, all across the board, I think we could all benefit from being really aware of and having dialogues around the types of stereotypes that exist and looking ways to advocate for refugees that go beyond those stereotypes. Okay, so turning to, a second maybe less obvious context for storytelling, I think would be refugee legal advocacy work, in my experience. And while we don't really think about storytelling in refugee legal representation, I think it's an important area where stronger storytelling can help support a person's claim for refugee status. Between my first and second year of law school, I went on a fellowship to work in Istanbul with an organization that provided legal support to refugees whose applications for refugee status had been denied and who wanted to appeal their case. And you may be wondering, again, how does storytelling come up here? Well, sometimes people's applications would be denied on legal grounds, and in other cases, they were rejected because the decision maker felt like the facts in a person's case weren't enough to support their refugee claim. So the organization in Istanbul asked me to spend long hours, with breaks, of course, interviewing refugees about the circumstances, refugees or asylum seekers, about the circumstances that led them to flee their homeland in order to address some of those gaps in facts in their application. And I think this was really where I heard refugees telling some of the most potent and powerful stories I've ever heard in my life, and about like the millions of hoops they jumped through just to be where they were. And what I learned in that experience is that when a person is able to tell their story, or their legal advocate is able to tell it for them through their paperwork and applications, it can be hugely pivotal to their legal case and could potentially help prevent them from being returned to a country where they fear persecution. And none of us are born storytellers. If anyone asked me what my life story is, I would have such a hard time summing up all different aspects of it, especially in a way that provides just the right details necessary for a legal case. Add on top of that the layer of trauma and how it can affect the recall of some painful memories. And I think you can imagine how it can be very difficult for a person to be able to be effective in telling their stories to support their case. So I think if legal organizations can try to set aside more time to allocate to interviewing refugee applicants and can try to use trauma-informed practices in their interviewing techniques, I think it can be hugely effective in advocating for refugees before the decision makers. And while interviewing refugees as part of my legal position, but also in my documentary interviews, refugees shared with me on numerous occasions that the process of telling their story to someone who could dedicate longer periods of just listening to them, as Richard said, listening, and sensitively, was a huge relief for them. And they would mention that they felt really heard and really seen. And so, of course, a process of interviewing can always run the risk of being traumatizing as well. And so that's where the trauma-informed interview skills can be very important. And I believe Bahar just shared a link to some important resources from the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. So I also saw it through these experiences of doing the legal advocacy work that those powerful stories, the potent stories, were a lot of the time sitting just in a folder, gathering dust, and they were very powerful and they could sway public opinion and help move people to move beyond just looking at others with a title of refugee to trying to see the person behind that. And so on a personal note, doing this type of legal work with refugees inspired me to later get into documentary filmmaking. And I wanted to find ways to visually explore their stories where they are the main storyteller in them. So another question I've been asked is, what are the best practices when telling refugee stories? And some of my examples here are coming from the filming context rather than the legal context. So building a rapport with the subjects is ultra important. Probably goes without saying, but letting them know more about you, taking the time to get to know them a bit beyond just the trials and tribulations of their refugee journey. And for me, when I'm asked to profile someone for a story, I end up spending far more time with that person than is required. Normally, a video like the one for UNHCR Canada that I'll show you in just a second can be filmed in about a day of filming, but we shot this in a period of 3 days, so we could really get to know the subjects a little more. And I prefer this, and I think it allows people to express themselves better because they feel more of a connection and they feel somewhat safer with you. And the same principle of building a rapport, I think, applies whether you're doing a documentary film or writing down a person's story or reporting on it. So now I'm going to just show a short video. And this is a 2-minute profile that we did at Fake Honey Pictures production company for UNHCR Canada on 2 privately sponsored students, Rhoda and Clement, who came to Canada through this unique resettlement program called WUSC, and you'll learn a bit more. It provides an opportunity to go to university and a pathway to citizenship. So I will just now try to share my screen here. Okay, just one moment, please.
And soon to be Canadian. I was born in a small town called Kapoita at the border of South Sudan and Kenya. My memories are about places, not real people, because I would meet neighbors today, and tomorrow we run to another IDP camp.
I was born in Kigali, Rwanda, and then we moved to Kenya. Every time I got like an award in school, my mom would be so proud. Education became like my only escape. If I wouldn't have gotten the WUSC scholarship, it would have meant that I wouldn't have gotten an identity, because you don't know if you're going to get an education.
Here I feel like there is protection, there is safer environment, there are services on campus that support students that I didn't have in the camp.
You're not trying to be the best in your class. You're also working hard to actually prove that you deserve the chance from the other 1,000 people you left back home.
In Kakuma refugee camp, when I graduated grade 8, we were only 8 girls. And out of those 8 girls, I came to Canada by myself. If I could not support them, I am hoping to support their children. And that is why I sponsor a child education to pay it forward. What has been given to me.
You're getting into this new culture. Are you going to just get all the knowledge and get out? Or are you going to actually give back to this community?
That feeling of empowerment makes me smile every day.
Okay, I'll just close this page. Okay, so yeah, so that was Rhoda and Clement, and it was really amazing to get to know both of them. We ended up gathering a ton of wonderful footage on them, and like so much footage that didn't fit in this video, including their personal interests, their hobbies. Rhoda does coding, and Clement is an amazing dancer, and we had footage of him dancing, and it didn't make the final cut for this specific story. But I think it's worth it to mention that in this case, both of them were giving back to their communities, and it's always celebratory when refugees are giving back to their communities or excelling in their field. But I think it's worth mentioning that this shouldn't be a requirement for all of the refugee narratives that we tell. Sometimes it might not be the case, or sometimes, you know, a resettlement experience can be a challenging one, and it can have all kinds of, you know, difficulty with access to employment or language barriers and all that. So I think there shouldn't be a pressure to only tell narratives that are, you know, positive or non-critical. And I just also wanted to mention there are certain things to be cautious about when telling refugee stories. Be mindful about ethical considerations. Honestly, I think almost every time I've worked with people who are forced to flee their countries, there's been some form of an ethical dilemma that came up. In one instance, I was filming in Athens at a refugee squat, and it was very difficult to get permission to film there because it wasn't an officially regulated location. And it was a school converted into a sleeping space for asylum seekers. And the person who ran it was pretty adamant about not capturing on film too many markers that would indicate the location of the squat. So I really promised not to, and all while filming and also in our post-production process, we made sure to leave out any identifying markers. Even though I was back in Canada, and at that point, you know, could have probably done whatever with the footage, I think it's really, really important to keep in mind the long-term interests of the people you work with. And so that also just brings me to this other point about respecting and being careful about the privacy and security of the subjects that you're working with. Getting someone's story can be impactful, but at what expense? And if you're sharing their story while they're still, in the asylum or refugee process, and there hasn't been a decision on their case, are you putting them and their safety at risk? If they've already been resettled in a new country, do you want to really be sharing their location or the reason why they fled? Is that going to have any issues for their family back home? So, there's all these kinds of considerations, I think, to keep in mind. So just in the interest of time, I think I'll just wrap up. And I think, as you can tell from my presentation, I think the refugee stories are always best told by refugees themselves as much as possible. But it's not possible in every case. And I think we have a responsibility to tell them in the most nuanced way as possible.